Good day and welcome to the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast for today, Tuesday, February 4th, 2020. My name is Tom Luongo. This is episode 19, and we have a lot to talk about. And today I'm going to talk a lot with Alistair Crooke, the contributor, along with myself, over at Strategic Culture Foundation. Alistair is also a former British diplomat and the owner and founder of Conflicts Forum. So without any further ado, I would like to introduce Alistair and welcome him to the show.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I followed your work and admired it greatly over the time.
Thank you very much, sir. So let's get started. The first thing, I know I want to get into the Middle East and Iran and all these other things, but since we're a couple of days past Brexit, and your background is far closer to the center of power in Britain than mine is, certainly being a hobby farmer in North Florida ultimately. Give me some of your thoughts early on what you think is happening in with Brexit, the way Boris Johnson is handling that. Is there any effect of how he and the Queen are going to approach negotiations going forward, and what you think is happening vis-a-vis that in the EU? So let's just start there.
Okay. Well, I think the key thing really has been that Boris Johnson has been taking actions that really are quite surprising. He's really broken the sort of conventional image in many ways. Everything that he should have done, he's almost done the opposite to do that. And I think that if you want to get to the bottom of what is happening now and where Brexit is going, he gave an interview to the Spectator magazine, and he said there that Brexit essentially, and this was quite interesting, he wasn't complaining about the European Union and its bureaucracy or any of the things that you might expect, but he said very clearly it's about inequality of incomes, inequality of how people are living in Britain. Mm-hmm. The difference is too great and has to be addressed. And this is what Brexit is all about. And so I think we are going to see something which is going to have an impact more widely. By more widely, I mean other European states will see this as a pilot scheme, an experiment. Mm-hmm. But what he said he wants to do is essentially address the inequalities between the prosperous city of London and the backward parts. Whereas he says that the standard of life has really deteriorated. Not only, and this I'm sure you'll hear echoes of this for the United States very clearly. Mm-hmm. I mean, the towns are run down, they're decrepit, the shops are shut, they're all gone. There's an out-of-town supermarket, which is probably not very good, but the towns are really sort of folding up, and it's an unhappy scene, and the incomes are not there, and it's not easy for people to earn a living.
No,
okay, go ahead. And so how's he going to do this? Well, I think what he's trying to do is something which is is relatively novel in one way. That is in the way for Europe. And that is to push the economy out of London, back out to the regions and to the extent of the UK. And also to reconfigure the UK as a sort of create a niche of technology between the great big giants of the United States and China and partly Russia, to try and find a little niche for the future where the UK can have its own, if you like, economic expertise. He sees rightly, I think, this is the war of the future. Technology is the currency of the future, more than the dollar or the sterling. This is where the fight is going to be, and he wants to find a place for that. So they've already started, in European terms, really putting massive funds aside for research and development. Partly government research and development, in the hope that startups and others will be, if you like an incubator, a sort of a nursery in which these institutions can come on. Then he wants to put, if you like, free trade areas around the country in the areas which have been suffering economically. Mm-hmm. The UK Treasury was opposed to this because they said, well, you don't actually gain anything from this in the overall picture. It's just a transfer of wealth from one part to another part. And I think Johnson's reply to the Treasury was, don't you see that's precisely what I want to do? I want to do that. That's what it must do to go there. And so I think he's looking at that and a change in trying to get people's incomes up, and also a very difficult thing, which he set himself as a sort of standard. How do I make these sort of rather, rather shambling, rather decaying towns around Britain, how do I increase the quality of their life? I mean, it's not just money. I mean, it's about the environment and about looking good and about pride in it.
Right.
And so I think this is the tactics. If you ask me, and I think this would be something that would not be very welcome for me to say it too explicitly, but I mean, really, this is the sort of economics that Russia understands. Mm-hmm. This is the economics that China understands, moving away from the sort of financialized economy towards absolutely real economics.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's going to work, but this is the challenge he set himself. What does it mean for the future? I think what it means is that the EU is going to play hardball again with Britain. And the EU are going to say, well, to the extent that you want to be different, to the extent that you won't accept our level playing fields, in that measure, so we will erect tariffs against you. The lower your regulatory base, the higher we'll put our tariffs against you. And I think that ultimately, this will just be unacceptable. It was going to be unacceptable in the sense of why the European Union trades with all sorts of countries. Why should it be able to set, the hours of work, the living standards and everything of UK workers if they're just going into a trade agreement with it? Right. So I don't think it'll be accepted. So I think we're heading for something that is closer to a no deal outcome with Europe eventually. So
I agree. And when you run as big a trade surplus as the UK does with the trade deficit as Britain does with the EU, it's pretty obvious that the Germans need the exports, and erecting tariffs only makes that scenario worse, right? And tariffs are ultimately, in every way, always a tax on the local population, as opposed to a tax on the foreign importer or whomever. And don't ever let Donald Trump, the ultimate mercantilist, tell you otherwise. That is just basic economics. And I think what I'm seeing from Johnson is exactly that. I think it's very interesting that you're saying all of those things, and it's exactly the same thing that Vladimir Putin was talking about, and how he's reforming the Russian government, in that he's trying to devolve power out of the presidency. I spoke with Alexander Mercouris at the Duran about this a couple of weeks ago, and devolving power out of the presidency back into the hands of the parliament, and to strengthen the Council of Regions in order to be a foreign policy setting body for all of the Russian Federation, but at the same time to also help direct fund flows from their massive trade surplus and their massive oil tariffs. Even with oil at $55 a barrel, they still are making the Russians are making so much money in this environment with the free floating ruble that it's insane. I mean, they run a trade surplus between 12 and 10 and $13 billion a month. Okay. I mean, if you listen to Putin's speech from his State of the Union speech, the translation was, we're making so much money we don't know what to do with it all. That's the way that was the simple translation to me. I was like, oh, that's okay. So now we need to change, and we're not spending that money efficiently, and we're not spending it well. And I think it's been interesting to see what Johnson is in many ways aping that. And again, I also saw Alexander Mercouris pointed me to an article in the Financial Times from the other day, where the FT was actually talking about Britain having kind words to say about Russia for the first time in a long, long time. And so there may be that thawing of relations, which I know has been, I know that British intelligence has been at this, from my perspective, at the epicenter of a lot of the anti-Russian stuff that's been happening over the last 5 or 6 years, from the Skripals to MH17 to Russiagate, Ukrainegate, all of it, the impeachment of Trump. And so much of that flows through at least various people within British intelligence and coordinated with the CIA. So it's to me, it seems like that's beginning to change. And that, I saw that last week with the outing of, or with the Times of London article that left Christopher Steele, one of the most protected men in the world, it seems, out to hang for having fabricated the Trump dossier, which in my mind was the catalyst for the impeachment against Trump to finally collapse, where renegade Republicans were finally able to be strong-armed into ending the charade and moving, so we can move forward. And there's a lot of people now who will be exposed to Trump's retribution if he wins re-election coming in the next year. So there's an interesting alignment that's happening here between Johnson, or realignment between the new Johnson government and Trump being able to consolidate power for the first time in his presidency. Not saying that that's also a good thing for the Middle East, and as I think we'll transition this talk over into the Middle East, because that has other attendant or knock-on effects. I think it's very interesting to see how that is starting to shape up, and that ultimately, in my mind, it still looks to me like Europe is being left out in the cold. So,
yeah, I think just to say a couple of things. It's always been the case, and that Britain has always said they will never allow if you like, an alliance between Germany and Russia to take place. It would be over their dead bodies.
Right.
And it's still very much an ethos that is there, that they cannot, Britain being at the very edge of Europe, cannot see Russia and Germany together in alliance. It's strategically for them something that is existential.
Right.
So that's partly, I'm saying that because it's a bit separate from the American deep state view. In terms of that, that piece by Christopher Steele, I mean, I'm just astonished it's taken people so long to finally sort of pronounce it nonsense.
Right.
I mean, I read it. It's just not even, remotely like a professionally written intelligence assessment. It's the language, everything is wrong. It was just ridiculous, a caricature almost. A spoof. I'm amazed, but yes. And this has been the sort of, if you like, I think the Achilles heel for the UK government has been the sense that the intelligence relationship between the UK and Washington was the most important foreign policy asset that they had. And that therefore they were much more open and much more vulnerable to CIA and others sort of coming in, Clapper and the head of CIA saying, well, look, it's inevitable. This won't happen. We tell you it's going to be stopped. Trump, it's not going to happen.
Right.
So, you need to help. And they made, I regard this as the most, potentially, if what we see is all correct, what we're talking about is the most extraordinary mistake by a European power like the UK to have thought at any point that it made sense to get involved in a conspiracy against a candidate president and then a sitting president of the United States. For what? It was just an extraordinary thing to contemplate. For the UK to do it particularly.
Right.
Very strange.
it was very strange, and and from my perspective, and again, I'm really just a glorified observer here, right? I was very much an outside observer, but from my perspective, and just watching this, I'm thinking to myself, how desperate did you have to be to? I'm talking about the CIA, I'm talking about the MI6, I'm talking about all these people. How desperate did you have to be that you needed to hold on to power this way? That how paranoid are you, right? Because I mean, one of the things about power is it makes you paranoid, and so the potential for a guy as compromised as Donald Trump to be president scared them that much that they went on this insane crusade to keep him from becoming president. And they thought they were going to get away with it, but at some point they get.
Or else perhaps they thought that it just couldn't happen.
Right.
That it just wasn't going to, that the powers against it were just too strong. I mean, I found this during this period because I've had to follow Brexit very closely, and I know you have too, but I had to follow it very closely for the internet. And, there was just this absolute conviction, one that was shared by Wall Street, incidentally. I mean, it can't happen. Right. Parliament is against it. There'll never be a Brexit. It won't be happen. It's just impossible. And that sort of hubris was so deeply, Goldman Sachs was sort of saying the odds against a sort of, Brexit was sort of 97% against or something like that. Ridiculous figures that were coming out.
Right.
And first of all, I mean, because they just didn't do their homework, they didn't understand what was going on in the country in terms of constituencies, and they just were, I mean, arrogant. And
it's unbelievable. I mean, but Alistair, I mean, I've been watching this as a libertarian, as an outsider, as a libertarian, as a political observer since 2008, when Ron Paul stepped up to the microphone and kicked Rudy Giuliani in the teeth, and everybody in the heartland stood up and went, "Yes, thank you, finally." And Fox News was up there going, "Well, Ron Paul, we think he's done." And it was Giuliani with this done. I'm like, y'all don't see this coming? You don't see the wave that's happening here? I mean, I saw it in 2008. Maybe it was a little bit of rose-colored glasses, certainly. But by 2012, it was a virus. It had jumped the shores. By that point, Nigel Farage was a rock star in my part of the internet, what I would call internet crank space. I'm like, and they didn't see it coming. They didn't see the millions of people who were just like, "Oh, no. We're going to elect Donald Trump because that's how bad Hillary is. We're tired of you people. We're willing to roll the dice with Donald frickin' Trump." Or, hey, we're willing to roll, and the Brits are almost saying, we're willing to roll the dice with Boris frickin' Johnson. And, also an almost cartoonish figure. But though not a mafia reality show star like Trump. But an even more ridiculous figure. But it's just, that's the level of frustration and anger and desperation that the people were feeling in the UK. Now they're feeling it. They're expressing it in Italy. They've expressed it in Hungary, the United States. It's mind-boggling that they would be not just arrogant, but again, but stupid.
And I think, this is what I call, to a certain extent, the like-mindedness factor. Everybody now, I mean, we are all so polarized in our societies that people only want to talk to the like-minded people, are like-minded, to read like-minded articles, to have engagement and to have friends who are like-minded. And, they can't possibly talk to someone who's a Trump supporter or who is a Brexit supporter. It's really, as bitter in the UK as in the United States in that way. So really, they have no sort of sense of this. I know one person in my wife's family who said, is there anyone else who supports Brexit than this one lonely old white male? This is a sort of, and And, the liberal elites of London, see themselves as Democrats in New York. That's where they'd like to go for their holidays, and they'd like to see it. So I really don't think they did see this, and they didn't understand. You took an average British town, which might have something like 200,000 immigrants, not all of them some of them from within the EU, from Poland and from other states. But, what was their concern was, is my grandmother, what's going to happen? She lives in a rented council flat. That is an apartment that is provided by the local authority at a reasonable rate. But now they have to accommodate all these refugees or all these people coming in who are homeless. The rents are going to go up and they're going to take away. What happens to grandma if she gets thrown out of her apartment? What happens at school when the class size has gone up from 25 to 30 to 45? Right. And a third of those don't speak English anymore. Right. And in the old days, I could get an appointment with my doctor in 2 or 3 days. I could take my child when they had a high temperature to see. Now I have to wait 3-4 weeks. You don't wait 3 or 4 weeks when your child has got a temperature and are worried about the health. This is what it was. It wasn't sort of racialism and bigotry. No. There may have been some of that, but it wasn't about that. And Johnson is right. It was about the contrast in the quality of life between the sort of, the affluent Londoners and the rest of the country. And if he doesn't put that right, he knows he'll lose the next election.
Yeah, no, I think that's very clear. And I think at the same time, I think it's, I have to wonder, I have to wonder about the role of the Queen. I feel this like that she's trying to clean up the royal family at the same time. And
it's going to be a big job.
Well, I understand that. I do. But, because Elizabeth is, but at the same time, I almost feel like for a long time, she's been a captured piece, that she hasn't been able to have any real influence. And at the same time, what I see from watching the UK, watching, short videos on Twitter of people in pubs cheering like their soccer team just won, the cup, right? The England just won the World Cup, when they're watching the Union Jack be folded up and removed from the European Parliament, and they're cheering like it's a World Cup victory. I'm like, the crown and the government need to restore the faith of the people in them, and that's what the biggest issue for Brexit has been this systematic grinding down of the validity of the institutions of power. Now, I think the EU was doing that on purpose. I think that was being done by the globalists like Blair and Lord Adonis and the rest of them. I think it's very obvious what they were trying to do, to me, and they failed. And now that they've failed, it is for Johnson and the Queen to reassert themselves at the top of the competence hierarchy, which a society needs to have in order to move forward. And this is their opportunity to start cleaning house and draining the swamp, as it were. And that's just what I'm beginning to see. And I think that, you said earlier that it was astonishing that the Christopher Steele took this long to be outed. It's because he was being protected by people who still had vestiges of power. And they've now been told, no, you don't. And I think that's the obvious tell to me. And I see the same things happening in the United States as well. So with people like Brennan and Clapper and Comey and the rest of them. So
I'm just not sure. I agree with all you say, but I'm not sure that they can recover.
No,
I'm not actually sure that they have that ability to recover credibility. I think there is a profound shift taking place across the globe, in fact.
Yes,
in many parts,
absolutely.
but certainly in the West. That there is the sense of the institutions have failed.
Yes.
There is a sense of loss of trust in democracy completely. Across the place. It's. I noticed the polls I saw coming out saying, 55%, 56% no longer in the global polls no longer have much confidence in it. It's not surprising.
No.
And I think if I put it in rather sort of blunt terms. I mean, the royal family have turned themselves really into a Netflix family.
Right.
I mean, it's all the sort of television sort of, I mean, can they put substance back into it now? They've gone down that road of, welcoming all of these sort of the most, popular, modern, liberal sort of ideas into the family.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if it's possible to get that back. I don't know that the elites are going to survive this.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think they have the adaptive ability, either in Europe or here, until there's a real crisis. Right. I think the only thing that changes people's minds in this is a real crisis.
Absolutely.
And these people will go on and on, as they have done for this time, until something really goes wrong very seriously, and that may happen. But,
I think we're much closer to that than a lot of people want to admit. I think the time frame is now. I think Brexit I think the after effects and the aftershocks of Brexit itself are going to continue to reverberate through capital markets into the next year or two, and then the political system. I saw something this morning that now a majority of Dutch want to leave the EU. They're holding back the dam in Italy with Salvini by every trick imaginable to keep him out of power. Angela Merkel's on her last legs in Germany. France is on fire every weekend, and no one seems to want to care and think that Emmanuel Macron is going to serve out his entire term. He likely will, but he could just as easily get guillotined too. I've been saying for a long time that for months now that I'm long guillotines and market speak, and that I saw one being trucked down the road in Puerto Rico on its way to the governor's mansion symbolically about a week and a half ago, and I just had to laugh. I'm like, oh, there you go. So when you're watching all these things happen, the institutions are failing, and once that trust is gone, it's very, very difficult to get back. It's the way it is, and it frankly is in many ways it's a very good thing, and it's been and in order for society to grow, it is going to have to hit rock bottom. And I keep saying this to people here in the U.S. I'm like, y'all, it's not bad yet. We haven't hit rock bottom yet. We're gonna hit rock bottom, but we're not there yet. Yeah. And I don't know that the fight over Brexit is that moment where the UK hit rock bottom. There may be another couple steps down the road, but you're much closer to it than we are. I will put it that way. So, speaking of all of that, speaking of rock bottom, and I think what will actually ultimately drive the U.S. towards rock bottom is its foreign policy and the empire. So why don't we shift gears a little bit and chat about the Middle East? I don't know how much more time you have. We've been going for almost a half an hour.
As long as you want. I'm fine.
Okay.
I'm free.
Okay, great. I just want to make sure that I'm not intervening. So great. So let's pop over to the Middle East, because I know that's your bailiwick, and you and I wind up conversing back and forth on in time and strategic on our pieces over strategic culture. I'm very, very worried about the way the U.S. is handling Lebanon, Iraq, Israel, the Palestinians, and all of that. And I certainly can't speak at a level that is that's commensurate with yours. So Trump's deal of the century, I guess we'll start there. And I see it as terms of surrender for the Palestinians. Tell me I'm wrong.
Oh, I won't tell you you're wrong. I'll tell you you're right.
That's what's known as a softball. I'm not a typically great interviewer, so we'll just go with that.
Oh, it's great. It's fine. I actually wrote a piece at the weekend. I think it'll go up probably.
I think it might have went up this morning, as a matter of fact.
Maybe.
Israel,
I wrote a piece. The metaphysical war.
Yes.
And I mean, to sort of reduce it to rather oversimplify it, I mean, that Israel sees itself and America sees itself is engaged in civilizational conflicts. I mean, what I mean by was the Cold War, in their view, validated everything about America. I mean, the film world, the movies, everything, economy, the system of governance. It won and it was a civilizational victory over communism, Marxism, more than it was even a political victory. And I think that what we have seen there was the attempt to sort of frame a position for Israel for this future. It was sorting out the domestic affairs and really telling the Palestinians, you have to sort of now offer fealty to the civilizational power, which is the Hebraic power in the region. And then it was also about starting to put into place the positions for a wider civilizational victory, bringing the Sunni world into that on terms rather as perhaps Rome might have done 1,000 years ago, dealing with its distant provinces. You have to, pay obeisance to Rome, but otherwise you can do your own thing to an extent. And I mean, this has always been the destiny of Israel in the view. And as America has become, in many ways, can I say, more Israeli, more Hebraic in its more Old Testament in its view of the world, so America sees, a victory of Israel as essential, almost on a par with its Cold War civilizational victory over Marxism. And I think you can see this. I mean, if I want to sort of explain it more, you can see this in the Pentagon recently has been talking about that China is a civilizational threat to the United States.
Yes.
That in every way, China poses a civilizational threat. And I know from previous sort of meetings with NATO that they have always felt that if the world doesn't see the West as civilizational vision as the future, we are finished. That is our end of our sort of our future. And I think in a way, what we're seeing playing out in the Middle East is been quite a desperate attempt to have a civilizational victory, this time against Islamic Republic of Iran, which of course has a different eschatology to Israel, sees the end of times in a very different way from the biblical Old Testament, and that this is the main oppositional power, and that if it fails in that, then it's failed. If it can't establish, if you like, its civilizational supremacy as a vision for people for the future in the Middle East, and it's taken over by another vision, then, that is an existential defeat for the United States. I'm talking, of course, really in terms that, the evangelicals would understand, the people who believe in a very literal sense of the region, people like the US ambassador, Friedman, who was saying, goodness me, it's biblical. We're going back to reactivating the biblical vision and the biblical world. That's the sort of people who have the sort of civilizational view of this war. And I think that, it would be seen almost, as a defeat of Islam on a scale, or of Islamism on a scale to which Marxism was defeated in the Cold War. And this drives both parties in the US in different ways. For Trump, he wants, Iran defeated because this would prove, he's wants them to come back on their knees and plead for a new agreement. He'd like that because that proves he was a great, art of the deal negotiator, and he was right all along, and enough pressure and Iran would crumble and come back. And the other side want it because they want it to prove the point about globalism is a civilizational project. It is a project that is going to, everyone has got to accept the civilizational view of the global order and accept the American-led global order as the only way ahead. There's no alternative. And I think, therefore, this is a great danger in this, in that even though they have coming at it from completely different ways, both parties in America sort of arrive at the same conclusion that they want Iran defeated in one way or another. And the pressure keeps escalating on Iran, keeps escalating. The protests in Lebanon, the protests in Iraq, the attempt to make protests in Iran, all part of a picture. And Iran sees us, and then the cyber war against Iran, and all of the other sanctions, escalation. And Iran sees no alternative but to push back. And it will continue to push back, I believe, and I don't know whether we will avoid it, but otherwise, I think we will be heading towards a regional conflict at some point, possibly in the not so distant future. And what happened in the East Room of the White House, I think, made that more likely, not less likely.
Explain that further. What do you mean by that?
What I mean by that was that, in a sense, there's always been quite a constituency in the Middle East that is pro-American, accepts American values, just as there used to be in Russia, although that's largely been discredited and gone, that, if you like, Atlanticist orientation in Russia. But it has existed. And in a sense, what I was expecting from the announcement between Trump and Netanyahu was a sort of unmasking of the United States as never having been even-handed, never having had any interest in other than cementing the hegemony of Israel, both locally and regionally in the Middle East. But what I hadn't really expected was it wasn't just unmasking, it was a complete undressing. And they stood there naked in the place. I mean, no one in the Middle East can have escaped that. And I think just as now, I find many people in Iraq who, not the Shia, who are all now very mobilized, even ones that weren't before, but I mean, even the Sunnis and the Kurds say, I mean, how can we defend the United States after what happened, at the assassination of the head of the PMU, and how do we accept this? And now after what has been said about in the White House, I think that what it does is it really makes it very, very hard for anyone. And you notice the protests in Iraq, of course, have now wound up. The protests about Iran and the government have all gone, and they've now turned into No America protests.
Yes.
And there were three big gainers from that event, and the first two were mostly for domestic reasons. Netanyahu in one case, Trump in another, in that he sort of consolidated in a difficult time the evangelical and the neocon support for him by going all the way and undressing completely on Israel and Iran. Iran is a big gainer from this because it will. It means effectively, I believe that America will be out of Iraq before too long, and then out of Syria before too long.
Yes.
And therefore out of the Middle East effectively, because the Gulf states are timid people and are already anxious and hedging their bets with Iran because they see, the writing on the wall.
And you can see the moves that China and Russia are making in parallel to this and in sympathy with this, with Russia setting OPEC plus policy at the margin, with China being willing to pledge military support to help Iraq defend itself while it goes about rebuilding its oil industry and trying to move into there. I mean, there's all of these things that are happening from that perspective. It's very obvious that at some point, Vladimir Putin is going to make a move that will change the game board that the United States will not be able to respond to. Will he sell Iraq, S-300s? And by the way, they'll be sold as S-300s, but they'll really be S-400s. They'll be S-300 PMU-2s, which are S-400s, but they'll be reported in the press as selling them S-300s. This is the kind of thing that you have to remember. We'll see something along those lines that will occur that the United States will not be able to respond to without getting into a war with Russia, which nobody in the White House or at the Pentagon wants, because you can't win a civilizational war if there's no civilization, because at that point I mean, you can't win a civilizational war if we're talking about that kind of conflict, because Putin's made it abundantly clear that he has weapons that we cannot counter on our side of the fence. The Iranians are now telling everybody that they have radar avoidance and EW systems that are similar to, if not as good as, the Russians. Whether the Russians gave it to them or not, it's good enough to beat the Patriots in the Iron Dome. So there's no safe place in the Middle East for assets anymore. It's not going to be about killing American soldiers or downing ships or anything like that. It's going to be more Abcake attacks on Aramco facilities. It's going to be more like Abcake. We're going to and Iran has plenty of sleeper cells, I'm sure, in the eastern part of Saudi Arabia, where most of the Shias live and work the oil fields, to just literally take Saudi Arabia off the map in terms of oil production. And that's the asymmetric threat that they represent. And to me, watching this play out is I think it is fait accompli. I agree with you that we're going to eventually be out of there. The details of this are shown in the actions of people like Erdogan in Turkey. The fact that the resistance in Idlib is collapsing because Erdogan moved all of his troops out, pushed them into Libya. At some point the Americans are going to have to have to stand up and go, we can't continue to maintain this fiction that we, control all the border crossings and into and out of Syria. It's not going to work anymore. And at some point, then I was talking to a friend of mine the other day about about Montreux and how Turkey controls the access to the Black Sea and all of the logistical limitations that Turkey can place on anybody entering and leaving the Black Sea, right? And so there's only so much force projection from a naval perspective that the United States can even engage in that region of the world, especially if Turkey is no longer, effectively a willing ally. So
I think I agree. In fact, I think actually, first of all, Russia's already made that decision.
Mm-hmm.
I was quite struck when I saw a very short interview with Buthena Shaban, who's political advisor to President Assad. And she was asked about Putin's surprise visit to Syria recently, when he went to Damascus and then he went to the Russian base. And she said, well, actually it's a response to the killing of Soleimani that's taking place and is becoming actualized. And then we had another event which didn't get much attention, but there was the meeting of the Turkish head of intelligence, Fidan, with the Syrian, Ali Mamluk, and with the Russian and the Iranian intelligence meeting together in Moscow to discuss the future response of the region to this. I think this is the new sort of driving force for policy. There's a lot of noise and other things that are going around and disputes about Idlib, but this is really the driving force. And I think that is right. I mean, Russia has boundaries on how far it will go in this process, but at the same time, it is a participant in the process, with careful boundaries set about, it not wanting to get caught up into a conflict between Iran and Israel or the United States. But nonetheless, I think that shift has taken place. And we see that with Turkey. I think you probably agree now that Turkey is clearly moving in that direction. And then that comes back to the big question in all of this time: Israel. Israel, when I was working there on behalf of the European Union for 9 years, had freedom of the skies. It could do what it wanted, when it wanted, to whom it wanted, as it wanted. That's no longer the case.
Right.
Actually, bit by bit, it's losing it. It may have some aerial capacity over Syria, but not absolute anymore. We don't actually know, and maybe even the Israelis don't know to the extent to which they have capabilities, aerial capabilities anymore. Iraq is changing, Lebanon is shifting. All of these states are in a process of flux. Israel really has two choices now. Either to accept this and to try and find some sort of modus vivendi in the new region as it emerges, or to try what Israel has always done in the past, is to sort of insert a new paradigm, do something unexpected and shocking and surprising that is going to change the whole paradigm. I think the latter is, I think Israelis as a whole, the security intelligence establishment, are much less certain they have that capacity anymore to do something, shocking and changing, paradigm changing, in a region where all the fronts are connected. 4 different fronts are all interconnected, and one paradigm shift might end up in something much larger than they expect. So is Israel culturally capable of making that change? Is it culturally able to shift? I don't know. Long ago, I was involved with my first peace process was in Southwest Africa, Namibia. And at that time, the South Africans regarded SWAPO, which was the resistance force in Namibia, as both Marxist and terrorists. And they demonized them so thoroughly that even though South Africans, wanted to move and to have a peace process, that peace process failed. And it took another decade or more before anything could emerge from it. But is Israel culturally capable of sort of going back on all of the demonization of the region in order to address the reality? I think that's a big, important question. I don't know the answer. We'll have to wait and see.
Right. Yeah, no, I agree. I think that is the answer. And I hope for everybody's sake, I hope everybody makes the right decision, because it's very obvious to me, just from a kind of strategic moving, what we board gamers would call moving dudes on a map, right? From that perspective, it's pretty obvious that there's a solution here that is not particularly difficult at the 40,000 foot level, which is that the Russians and the Chinese, to a lesser extent, guarantee the behavior of Iran and its proxies, and the United States guarantees the behavior of Israel and its proxies, and the Saudi Arabians, and everybody settles down and decides to start making money, and allow capital to flow, and by doing that allow ideas to flow and allow cross-pollination to flow. But if we're going to continue to look at this as a generational or existential crisis or civilizational event, then that precludes that from occurring. And I don't think Trump sees it this way. This is one of the interesting things about Trump. I don't know that Trump sees it this way. And I think that's the only part of this that I feel has any, what's the word I'm looking for, has any hope to avoid a conflict. That ultimately, at the end of the day, he does just want to solve the big problems. That's his ego. That's his ego form. That's his narcissism writ large, right? He wants to solve North Korea and Iran and the European Union and trade, and we can do all this. We can do it. We can do it. And that's what I see from him. But at the same time, that means stepping on so many toes in the process, and so many entrenched ideologies and entrenched agendas within the foreign policy establishment in the UK, in the US, in and around the region, that it's difficult to begin that process and actually end it in a reasonable manner. I think he's crazy if he thinks he's going to do it in even in the next 5 years. But
I think one of the things. Sorry to interrupt you, but
sure, no, go right ahead.
Bearing on this is something that a friend of mine who's been inside a long time inside the American establishment, and he is lecturing at the military military academies and things like this. And he's a professor, and he said to me, I asked him about the state he saw amongst Washington, and he said, it's never been good, but I've never known a situation where America has completely lost the ability to empathize. And he said, when it comes to it now, America, for America, Iran is the devil. Russia is incomprehensible, and Chinese is off the board. I mean, they can't possibly understand what is going on. But what is different is that people don't really want to or don't try. And so what we're having in the United States now is a process where people artificial intelligence to substitute for this sort of lacunae in their consciousness, so that if we gather enough data about Iran, we don't need to empathize or understand what Shiism is or anything else. We can just do it in this way. But this technical way of approaching it, I mean, can never solve or even begin to understand a problem or deal with in Iran. And that's where I'm not sure, that Trump, he may have, some of the instincts of a pragmatist, but, you can't, it's not, I don't think he's ever met any person who isn't purely motivated by material gain. Mm-hmm. And I think he cannot understand then that Iran can take the position of not wanting to talk to him because, I mean, I can give them benefits, they can get huge benefits. And they don't I don't think he's ever met someone who has principles and will act on principles.
Well, and he doesn't have any.
Well, precisely. That's why he can't understand it. It seems quite crazy. So I think I really do think this is the problem, that, I mean, we don't have anyone who understands. I'll tell you an anecdote, just if I may, if you've got a moment.
Absolutely.
To explain it. I remember talking to the Brazilian foreign minister when Lula was president. And at that time, there was an attempt it was a joint attempt by the Brazilians and the Turks to come to a nuclear agreement with Iran. Mm-hmm. And so they wrote to the president at that time and said, what are your objectives? Can you send me a written letter of what you want to see in order to come to an agreement with Iran? So they got that letter and they went and see it. And the foreign minister said to me, then we got, we were in Tehran and we talked and everything. And then we got a message to come and see the supreme leader. And the president turned to me, the Brazilian foreign minister, and he said, what do I say to him? I mean, what am I going to say? I mean, I'm not going to start negotiating with him, am I? I mean, what do I do? What does one do in these situations? Right. Prime Minister said, look, I haven't a clue. What do you do? And so Lula just went there and he talked about his history as in the favelas, that the poor parts of Rio, and how he was brought up and from poverty and made it to the top of Brazil, and how he understood people because he'd been there at the part of the dispossessed. Supreme Leader listened to all of that and he said, okay, it's done. You have it. And so he got the agreement. I mean, they didn't say anything. They just talked about, the time.
Right.
And they could understand each other. And he felt here was someone who could understand the reality of Iran, and he could understand his reality. And of course, they got an agreement which followed the letter of Obama's setting out of his conditions. And then Condoleezza Rice said, rubbish, only white people get involved in this. What are you doing? This is way above your pay grade. Get out. And they were told to move on. But I'm saying in the Iranian idea, you have to have this ability to, if you like, empathize with otherness and to be able to understand it. And your consciousness has to reach that stage in which you can see beyond, and you can see, and if you like, interpenetrate with something that is distinct and other to you.
Right.
And I find that, I just think that at the moment is probably beyond, I hope it isn't, but I feel it's probably beyond the White House to do that sort of negotiation.
And and I think it's certainly beyond the capability of Tel Aviv. So,
yes,
I think it's
pinpoint. That's my, I'm not a pessimist
right.
by nature at all, but
Sure.
This is why I don't see an easy off ramp. And the Europeans have just burnt the last off ramp there was, which was by trying to get rid of the JCPOA altogether, which the Iranians said that's the way out. We can try and, let's use that as a framework.
We can use it as a framework and at least stay in the deal, even if the deal's not great. Stay in the deal because it shows that you respect the process, not necessarily the components. And the rank and cynical manipulation of the process of the JCPOA, or the letter of it, in order to get it to the point where it is now, which is that it's going to go to the UN Security Council, where the United States can veto and kill what's left of it by Europe implementing the dispute resolution. By creating that, by doing that, it's just classic, I like to say, like left brain, logical. This is our goal. This is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to achieve this goal. And it doesn't matter what the consequences are. And that's where we are. That's what I see happening. That ossification of thought certainly exists within Netanyahu's government. And it absolutely exists as well, as you've rightly pointed out, within both wings of the bird of prey that is the Democrats and the Republicans and the foreign policy establishment in Washington. And that's the problem. And Putin is standing there, a man with principles, standing there going, what are you all doing? You do realize where this goes, right? You go back to that great speech he gave at the UN right before he intervened in Syria and said, do you realize what you have done?
Yeah.
And in speaking about Libya, and that sticks in my mind. And from the moment Trump entered the White House and the moment he bombed al-Sharat, the airbase after the chemical false flag at Khan Shaykhun, I said that was the biggest geopolitical blunder he could have possibly made, because he, at that moment, revealed himself to be, one, out of his depth, and two, incapable of reading the situation and knowing full well that no one's going to be able to deal with this man because he's not dealable. He is, he's been manipulated into a position where he's easily manipulated into a position where he will not, any agreement he tries to negotiate won't stick because everybody around him controls him.
Yeah.
And he's done.
And this is the view across the Middle East at the moment. There's no point.
There's no point in talking about him.
No point in talking. And, this is we can glide over it. But, this is so important. If there's no one to talk to, there's no diplomacy. There's no possibility of diplomacy. And the other thing, I mentioned another story because this is the thing that is changing the Middle East so much. Couple of 2 years ago, I think, I was invited by the Institute of the Two Holy Mosques at Karbala to spend 10 days at the mosque of Imam Hussein in Karbala. I lived inside the mosque and I ate inside it and I attended all of its functions there. And then I gave a talk at the end of it to the congregation at the mosque. And it was an extraordinary experience. The actual energy of the pilgrims that were coming to see the shrine of Imam Hussein. I have explained to your listeners, Imam Hussein was the grandson of the Prophet who was killed at this famous battle in about 68. Yeah, 68. But the whole of it was palpable. It was like a sea of energy. And I realized, these people are not living in my contemporary world. They are there with Imam Hussein. They are right back 1,000 years. They are with him. They're experiencing his thirst and his anger and his defeat and his victimhood. I mean, they are living in a different dimension to ours. And it's an extraordinary sense of energy and mobilization that was present. Then I went and met the Hashad leaders, and I went up to meet the people coming down from Mosul. And every day coming into the mosque, anyway, into the Imam Hussein Mosque, a martyr in the morning, a martyr in the evening, two one day, one the next day. Their anger against Saudi Arabia and against America for what's happening, and the tales that I heard from those families from Mosul. I remember so well one small, I met a small girl. She must have been about the same age as my daughter then, at about sort of 7 or 8. And I said hello to her, and she wouldn't say anything. And I said, well, just tell me your name. And she was absolutely silent. And I spoke to the man who was next to her, and I said, is she very shy? Won't she speak to me? And he just looked at me and he said, she's never said a word since she saw all her brothers and her father beheaded in front of her eyes in Mosul. And she's never said a word since. And it was typical of the sort of stories that I heard. It was incredible. An old man who said, I'm going back to restore my village in the north, except it's only me. I'm the only man left. There's no one else in my village that exists. Daesh, ISIS has killed them all. And the sort of feeling. And then I know when at the end of it, I gave this talk, and I was asked to speak about Imam Hussein, and I gave a short talk. And then at the end of it, and I didn't see, I mean, there were several thousand people there. It was Friday press and things, give talk. And this was unconnected to me, and I didn't even realize it. As soon as I started my talk, out come the photographs of the martyrs. Everywhere, photographs of martyrs. It wasn't aimed at me. It was aimed at the television cameras for Baghdad and for Najaf. But it was very powerful. And wherever you went, these people, were poor as anything, dirt poor, but they had incredible pride and mobilization and energy. And I realized Iraq is changing dramatically. And all these people, they despised Baghdad and the Green Zone. They had respect for Sistani, not so much respect for the Hausa, for Najaf. It was very powerful, the energy, and this is what's running through the region. The Sunnis are scared by it. They're really scared by it. I mean, this is a sort of energy that is, and this is why Baghdad is so scared. This energy is always running ahead of them. They're trying to contain it and hold it back and stop it turning into something more powerful. But it runs ahead of them. And the young clerics are with the people, not with the old guard who would like to turn to a sort of old quietism of the past. And so, this is it. At the same time that the Sunni, if you like, system is, well, it's been sort of deteriorating since the Ottoman times. I mean, and losing credibility and legitimacy and losing it as a system of governments. I mean, whether it's the Gulf or Egypt or the Ikhwan, the Muslim Brotherhood governance, they're all discredited now. And there's no real sense of credibility in any system of governance. And then you have this power coming, popular power that is president. So you have, the Sunnis sliding down and the Shia power rising strongly upwards. And that's giving rise to this sort of huge tension in the region. But there's no way of dealing with it. You can't, it's something that is, the genie is out of the bottle. You're not putting it back in.
It sounds like something far more profound than what's happening here in the West. The things that we opened this conversation with, vis-a-vis
Yes.
Brexit and all of this, that it sounds like a much more profound version of that. Because obviously we haven't had our villages wiped out. We haven't had our brothers and sisters beheaded this way. And because of that, that should give everybody in Washington pause. I don't know how else better way to end this conversation than that. I could sit and talk with you for hours, but I think that here is a good stopping point. We'll probably, if you would be so kind as we can do this again at some point in the future, that would be great. I'm having a hard time holding it together right now after listening to all that. That's all I have to say. This is really deeply disturbing.
You do such good work, and it's really important. And I know you feel sometimes you must be banging your head against the wall, all sorts of walls. But really, you do great work, because somehow, maybe in a little way, you can sort of shift consciousness by the things you do. So anyway, congratulations on it.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you so much for your time and the kind words and your support and everything else. Because I remember when I first got the call, I got the notification that you had become one of my patrons. Thankfully, on Patreon, I was floored. I was completely floored, and at that moment, I think that I am beginning. I'm on the right path, and the path has always been very clear for me. I've spoken with Lou Rockwell about this a couple of months ago, and I think we all have to find that moment where we're willing to do what we need in our lives to say, okay, this is how I'm going to make my life have purpose, because it's when we are our best. Ultimately, is when we have a purpose to make our corner of the universe a slightly less hostile place. Alistair Crooke, thank you so much for everything. I will hopefully talk to you when the next time you have time.
Tom, thank you equally. Bye-bye then.
Take care now. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Gold, Goats, and Guns podcast. We'll be back at a minimum next Tuesday, though I may do another one of these later in the week. Depends on whether the spirit moves me. As always, you can follow my work over at tomluongo.me. You can also support the podcast and myself through Patreon at patreon.com/Gold, Goats, and Guns. You can follow my live streams every Monday night at 8 o'clock and every Friday night at 8:30 p.m. on YouTube and DLive.tv. Other than that, you can also, if you so need to, you can donate to the channel through PayPal or various cryptocurrencies. There will be links in the description of the video down below, along with links to Alistair and my latest articles on the subjects discussed today. I hope you all have a great week. Be well. We'll talk soon. And keep your stick on the ice.